Good afternoon and welcome to the third SRA presentation of the year. Our presenter today is Dr. Deborah Morgan, from a senior researcher at the Centre for Innovative Ageing at Swansea University. Deborah is a senior research officer in the Centre for Innovative Ageing at Swansea University, and she specialises in loneliness and social isolation in later life. Her research has explored transitions into and out of loneliness and social connections. She has a background in health and social care research, disability and chronic illness across the Lifecourse. Deborah works closely with the Campaign to End Loneliness, the Mental Health Foundation and the Older People's Commissioner on issues around loneliness. Deborah also sits on the Loneliness and Isolation Strategy Board and Public Health Network Cymru. So thank you, Deborah, for giving this presentation today, and please start when you're ready.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. So, as Hannah said, I'm interested in loneliness and in older age, but also across the life course. And loneliness is something we've heard a lot about in recent years, and it's been amplified in the last 12 months by the COVID-19 pandemic, with a lot more people experiencing so-called COVID loneliness as a result of the restrictions that we've all been placed under. But what people are now experiencing, for most people, will be a transient experience, while for others, the experience of loneliness during the pandemic will go on to become a chronic issue. Yet, for many people, even prior to COVID, loneliness and social isolation was an issue for a great number of people, and will be long after the pandemic is over. So what is loneliness? Loneliness is an emotion much like joy, happiness, sadness, etc. Yet unlike other emotions, it's one that we're less likely to reveal or discuss how we're feeling because of the stigma and negative associations that are attached to it. And despite it being a normal human emotion, it's been described as an evolutionary mechanism that is designed to remind us that actually we need other people around us. In much the same way as we feel a physical pain if we've injured ourselves, loneliness is a sign that something is wrong and we need to have social connections. So in academic terms, we describe it as an unpleasant feeling or an emotion that occurs when there is a mismatch between the quality or the quantity of relationships we have and those we'd like to have. And what this means is you can have just two friends and never feel lonely because those friendships meet all your needs. Or you might have a lot of friends and family around you and still feel lonely because those relationships are lacking in quality or quantity. And as I said, loneliness can be temporary, like a fleeting feeling, which we might experience when we start a new job, we might move to a new area, or we might experience one of those key transition points that can be a trigger point for loneliness, such as having a baby, retirement, moving to a new area, and so on. But loneliness can also be a chronic experience. And this is where we see those long-term negative effects on physical and mental health. And we often hear loneliness being used in conjunction with social isolation. And although they're related, they are entirely different constructs. While loneliness is a subjective construct, social isolation is more objective. It's something that we can measure by the number of people we see or hear from within a specified time period. And it's commonly defined as a state in which the individual or group expresses a need or desire for contact with others, but is unable to make that contact. So it's a situation where the number of social contacts is significantly diminished. And what this means is we can be lonely without being isolated, and we've all heard the old adage, lonely in a crowd, or we can be isolated without being lonely, because as I said previously, all our relationships meet all our needs. Or of course, we can be both lonely and isolated. Loneliness is also not the same as being alone, because aloneness refers to being by oneself. Similarly, solitude is the state of being alone, so it's a voluntary state. But loneliness often gets conflated with social exclusion, which is about the separation of individuals and groups from mainstream society. And loneliness is an outcome of social exclusion. So what we do know is loneliness is complex and multifactorial. It's something most of us will experience, even, albeit fleetingly at some point in our lives. But for others, it is a chronic issue. extending over that long period of time. And for a small number of people, it's an issue that they have right across the life course. It's not a linear experience. You can be lonely and recover, only to be lonely again at a later time point. There can be a seasonal element to loneliness. We can see it amplified by key anniversaries or holidays. And we often hear loneliness talked about around Christmas time. And there's a strong variation in how people who are lonely cope with it and whether they will transition out of loneliness, which was the focus of my PhD. So who's lonely? Popular narratives we hear in the media indicate that prevalence of loneliness is really high among older people. And we can see this reflected in sort of lurid headlines in the media about a loneliness epidemic. But we also hear it in the narratives of policymakers and politicians. But as you can see on this slide, which came from the National Survey of Wales, loneliness is also high in younger people. And this finding is consistent with other surveys, such as the BBC Loneliness Survey, which also showed like a U-shaped distribution in loneliness, with prevalence being high in the younger and older populations, but declining in midlife. However, not all things are equal, and not all younger people will experience loneliness in the same way not all older people will experience it. And when we hear a lot about loneliness and we see it represented in statistics, we actually hear and see less statistics around social isolation. And that's because we don't routinely collect data on social isolation outside of academic research. And that is an oversight that really does need to be addressed because, as I said, we can experience one or the other, or we can experience both. So what causes loneliness and social isolation and who's at risk? And on the slide is a theory that we use called the cognitive discrepancy theory. And it's about those pathways into loneliness. So we know that there can be certain factors that can predispose us, make us more vulnerable to loneliness as we get older, or even in younger ages, we'll see later on. And these predisposing factors can include where we live. So we've had research undertaken in the 90s by Scharf et al., who found loneliness was very high in areas of high deprivation. And this was supported more in more contemporary research by research undertaken by Kearns et al. In Glasgow, who also found that loneliness was high in areas of high deprivation, where residents felt trust was low, trust in their neighbours, there was a high fear of crime, and they felt that the area was unsafe. And all those factors contributed to loneliness. But you can also see we've got age, marital status. So if you're never married or divorced or widowed, you're more likely to be lonely. Your social economic status is also important. So as well as living in an area of high deprivation, we tend to use proxy measures, so low levels of education and housing tenure as proxies for economic status. And we know that people who live in council houses or who have low levels of education are increased risk of loneliness. And then we've got personality characteristics. And what's interesting about personality characteristics is because they can make social interaction more difficult. So if you're very shy or inhibited or introverted, it will inhibit your social interactions across your life course. And what I've put on the slide is some data taken from my own research. And we know that factors such as low self-esteem and interpersonal control are related to predictors of loneliness. And you can see that here with the coefficients. So if you have low self-esteem, you're between 1.4 and 3.5 or 4.5 times more likely to experience loneliness than if you have high levels of self-esteem. And similarly, we see the same with interpersonal control. And what is interesting that with personality characteristics is that from the interviews I've undertaken with older adults, when they describe themselves as being shy or introverted, they internalise the cause of their loneliness, and that affects the coping mechanisms they'll use to manage it on a day-to-day basis. And what I found was that those who believed that loneliness was attributed to these personality characteristics were less likely to see loneliness as something that they could modify, and they would therefore just use strategies to distract from it and to minimize those negative feelings rather than adopt strategies to eliminate loneliness. But I think an important caveat here is we mustn't blame people who have those personality traits of shyness or introversion, because they're a precursor, they're not a cause. And many people with those personality traits are not lonely, but for some, as I said, it's more a predisposing factor. So who's at risk? So if we look at younger age groups, we know that people with disabilities or with limiting illnesses are more likely to be lonely. And in fact, about 50% of people with a reported disability also report loneliness. Similarly, we know people who are unemployed, as we said previously, living in an area of high deprivation, new mums, students, children who are homeless, those who are in care or are care leavers, children who've experienced abuse or neglect, those with mental health problems, carers, both children and adults, and young parents are all at risk of being lonely. And when we get to older age, as you can see on this slide, the risk factors are many and diverse. And I've sort of grouped them here into socio-demographic, health, life events, and social isolation as a function of location. So if they've got an asterisk next to them, they're also a risk factor for social isolation. And you can see again, we've got housing tenure, access to a car, the availability of family and friends, age. So the older you are, the more likely you are to become lonely. Some of the others in the health factors we've already discussed, disability, being a carer, cognitive impairment. There was some work done several years ago now with older adults who displayed signs of cognitive impairment, significant cognitive impairment. But when they examined their brains post-mortem, they had none of the underlying clinical signs, which led the researchers to suggest that actually it was loneliness mimicking those signs of cognitive impairment. In terms of life events, widowhood, we expect bereavement to be one of those common triggers, but admittance to a care home is also a risk factor, as is retirement migration. And we often think that, when we retire, we might want to disappear off into the sunset and go and live by the coast or live in the countryside. But actually, for many people, that actually can be a trigger for loneliness, as some of my participants described. But we can also see that there's also other risk factors related to the location. So things like a lack of accessible transport, lack of local facilities, and urban and rural risk factors that can increase the likelihood of being lonely if you're an older adult. So how do these risk factors predict the different categories of loneliness? My research for my PhD looked at these psychosocial risk factors and grouped them into the different categories of loneliness that I discussed previously. So to do this, I did a fourfold typology, which was proposed by Townsend and developed by Tunstall. And I combined the de Jonge-Erveld loneliness scale with a Lubin social network scale to give us 4 loneliness categories. So we had lonely and isolated, not lonely, isolated, isolated, not lonely, and neither lonely nor isolated. And to do this, I ran some bivariate analyses just to check the association between loneliness and isolation with a range of different variables that you'd seen on the previous slide. And if variables were significant at the 5% level, they were included in a multinomial logistic regression. And if they had an asterisk next to them, if they were, some variables were non-significant, and these were excluded. So I entered the data for the multinomial logistic regression models into blocks, similar blocks to the ones we saw with the risk factors, starting with the socio-demographic, then health, then the psychological resources, which were low self-esteem, and social participation as block 4. And we used reference categories for the logistic regression, and these were not lonely, not isolated, being older, having a high education, having children, having high self-esteem, and being quite distant from family, geographically distant. And on the slide, I've just got some of these sort of trimmed models, which contain only the variables that remain significant. And this first one is not lonely, not isolated. And you can see here that those with low levels of education in the lonely, not isolated category were less likely to report being lonely. And we can see this because there's a negative coefficient next to the 0.326. And this indicates that those with a higher level of education were more likely to be lonely, which is in contrast to what we know about loneliness being this socioeconomic gradient. Similarly, we found that people who reported no depression were also less likely to be in this category. And low levels of interpersonal control were predictive of being lonely and not isolated, which suggests to me that when we look at the next slide, that actually the low level of education may be more significant in relation to social isolation, because it's related to those financial resources that enable us to maintain an active social life and join those groups, than it is maybe to loneliness. And if we look at the next one, this is isolated, not lonely. And you can see here, you can see the asterisk next to the 3 asterisks, which is statistically significant. That we've got being male, being older, so aged 85 plus, and having a low level of education makes it more likely that you will be isolated but not lonely. So this is why I say I think isolation suggests that social isolation is related more to resources, financial and social, as opposed to just loneliness. And then if we go into the final model, this is the lonely and isolated one. And you can see there are a number of categories here that are statistically significant. And this is the final trim model where we've thrown everything in. So again, being male, being older than 85, having depression, low self-esteem, and low levels of interpersonal control predicted being included in this lonely and isolated category. If you were married, you were less likely to be in this category, whereas single, never married, had the greatest likelihood of being lonely and isolated. And I think looking at loneliness and isolation grouped into these categories gives us a more nuanced analysis, but it helps us develop solutions that actually mitigate or alleviate loneliness, because we assume lots of the interventions, and we'll touch on interventions shortly, think that if you put lonely people with other people, you will eliminate loneliness. But this is, as these models are suggesting, that is not necessarily the case. So why is loneliness important? We know from existing research that social relationships are a really strong predictor of longevity and health. And this was illustrated in research by Julianne Holt-Lundstad and colleagues, who undertook a meta-analytic review to determine the extent to which social relationships influence our risk for mortality. And most people probably have heard that a quote from Juliana's research, which equates loneliness to smoking a number of cigarettes a day. But what they found when they were looking at which aspects of social relationships were highly predictive and which factors moderated the risk to health, they found that after looking at 148 studies with over 300,000 participants, that the factors we associate with poor health and reduced mortality, such as poor air quality, obesity, physical inactivity, and smoking, actually had lower odds of reduced mortality than those relating to our social relationships. And in fact, social relationships was the strongest predictor of dying early, with those with adequate social relationships having a 50% greater chance of survival than those who had a deficit. And this effect remained constant regardless of whether, when they remain consistent across a number of factors, including age, sex, their initial health status at the start, and again in the follow-up period, and the cause of death. And it strongly suggests that the association between social relationships and mortality is across the board, and it's not just restricted to subgroups of the population, which is something that we've seen arguments for, that lonely people are more likely to engage in damaging health behaviours, which accounts for their reduced mortality. And this research suggests that's not the case. An actual fact that our social relationships is something we all need to attend to, in the same way as we go to the gym or we eat healthily, we need to focus on our social relationships for our health. And you can see on the slide, we've got some examples of some research that's been done. So we know it increases high blood pressure, you get increased self-harm in men, it increases the risk of developing coronary heart disease, can increase the risk of cognitive decline and dementia, and I touched on that previously. And social isolation, when they've looked and taken measures, biomarkers from individuals who are socially isolated, they see an increase in their inflammatory markers. So you can see it's actually having an effect on the body at a cellular level, which is fascinating in itself, but explains why we really need to attend to our social relationships. But it's not just our physical health, it's our mental health as well. And we know, as I said, that it comes with a number of risk factors, and they're here on, some of them are on the screen here from my research. So we've got a female here who says she came out of a very, very dark place. This was a woman who had no family of her own. She was an only child, who married an only child. And when he died, she had no family left. She'd lost her sister, her cousins, and she was the only one left. And she just didn't care if she didn't get up in the morning. And she used to she told me that it was just, she just had to get each day done, day by day. And she had to talk to herself to kind of get herself motivated to even get up in the morning. And it had a dreadful impact on her mental health, to the point that she would talk to her husband, even though he was no longer there, just so her voice filled the room, because she'd go weeks without speaking to another person. And again, there's a quote there from one of the male participants who'd been a long-term carer for his mum, and when she died, he said he didn't care if he dropped dead because he was so lonely, he didn't know how to help himself. And I interviewed this gentleman a few times as part of the cognitive function and aging study. And it was only when I went back to interview him again, he was actually making that transition out, because he'd been able to reflect on how far he'd come. Since his mum had died, but he was lucky he had support from family who were able to step in. So what can we do about loneliness? It's one of those things that we only think about if we ourselves are affected by it, or if it affects those that are close to us. And I think to a large extent, it's very much shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. And while we can't do anything to prevent some of the circumstances that can act as a trigger, so bereavement, we can't stop people dying, we can offer ourselves some protection by having a very wide and varied social network. But if we do experience it, and we don't attend to it, it can become chronic. And once that happens, it becomes entrenched, and it's really difficult to come back from. But addressing loneliness and isolation is not as easy as just going out to meet other people. Loneliness and isolation are experienced as disruptive events, and as such, they make the individual question who they are. And I put some examples of these sort of biographical disruption aspects on the slide. And the biographical disruption is a theory that's been taken from chronic illness. And when I was analysing my transcripts, it occurred to me that there were so many similarities with the way people were describing the disruption to their lives because of loneliness, as opposed to those who were describing the impact of a chronic illness on their everyday life. And actually what loneliness and isolation do, they disrupt the structures of normal life and the forms of knowledge that underpin them. And it's been described as a tear in the fabric of one's life. Loneliness effectively punctuates their life course into before and after the event. And for me, the concept of biographical disruption has a utility as a descriptive device to understand how loneliness impacts on the individual, but also it's an explanatory device to explain and understand that how an individual responds to loneliness and how they adapt to it. So people who are able to redefine themselves, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in relation to some of these quotes, they're able to find ways to recover. So in the first quote here, this disruption of taken for granted assumptions and behaviours. And this participant had been divorced. It came as completely out of the blue to him that his wife was leaving him. They just relocated. They were feeling quite isolated because they didn't know anyone where they were living. They were living in a very small rural community. And he said, when his wife left, he had to rethink his whole life. He couldn't cook for himself. He didn't know what to do with his time. And it just made him question everything that had gone on. He thought marriage was for life. And obviously it hadn't. And it sent shockwaves through his relationships with his children. We also see that people experience these disruptions in their explanatory systems. So one of the males told me, I'm not a person anymore. I never thought I'd get into the state I'm in now. And this man had worked, he was a market trader, he'd been a builder, and he just couldn't marry up the social person he used to be with the lonely person he was now. He was unable to go out on his own, he couldn't get in. When people suggested maybe you should go to a pub and try and meet other people, he couldn't do that because it had disrupted him to such an extent, he no longer recognised himself. But it's also the way in which other people respond. And it's a process which involves the mobilisation of resources. So this is one of my oldest participants. And he had family, but they were all dispersed. And he had a very, very tight friendship group. And when his wife died, his friendship group really stepped in. And as it says in the quote, he doesn't play golf anymore, but a friend picks him up and takes him to the club twice a week. But this was a man who was used to doing for others and reciprocating. And because he could no longer reciprocate, it meant he didn't really want to accept the offers of help that were there. I mean, not everyone had that help available. Some people found that the events that triggered loneliness and isolation fractured their relationships with their family and friends, leaving them with no resources to mobilise. And one participant in particular had a family member who'd walk past his house every day and nobody ever called in. And in fact, when I interviewed him, he kept Skype open on the computer because he was hoping someone would come on to talk to him, but nobody ever did because he didn't know anybody who he could connect with. And as I said, we often think of lonely and isolated individuals, well, lonely individuals in particular, as having few family and friends. But what the research did show that many individuals that I interviewed actually had quite large networks around them. But as this 84-year-old male showed, they were reluctant to draw on them because they couldn't reciprocate any longer. And that actually had implications for this man's loneliness trajectory, that he was on a chronic pathway. So if these issues can be resolved and the wider social network responds in the way we'd hope they would, you've got a good chance of recovering from loneliness. And in my research, a large proportion of the participants were on that decreased trajectory. However, some people reported being stable or worsening loneliness. And that can occur when they experience additional knocks to their confidence, or, as I said previously, they internalise loneliness, attributing it to being shy or introverted. And for these people, loneliness and isolation can become entrenched. And that's problematic because then they might need other forms of support to go back out into the social world. And that might mean they might need grief counselling, they might need confidence building, or other forms of support. For some people, it's literally hand-holding, taking them to events and re-engaging them back in the networks that they used to be part of previously. So it's a very personalised approach, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. And on the slide, I've put things that I think we need to think about for ourselves, but also how we can support others. So for ourselves, we need to think about and prioritise those relationships we already have, and try to expand our networks through new groups and making connections, because all the research shows the more diverse your network, the better. And we need to think and change the way we think about our relationships. It's too easy to say, oh, so-and-so doesn't want to, is not ringing me back because, you know, they're just being funny with me, but actually that person may have other things going on at the time. So I think we have to adopt a more positive attitude, even when we feel quite negative. And we need to do more to try and build trust. And with regards to supporting others, I think we need to know and publicise more what those risk factors are for loneliness and those important transition points, so that we can step in and support people better. But I think we also need to remove the stigma and talk about our own experiences of loneliness. And that's something I've done. And I know people think that actually talking about loneliness is quite difficult, but you'll be surprised when I tell people I study loneliness. I very often get their loneliness stories. I get taxi drivers telling me about the people that they work with, that they pick up weekly, and then they tell me how lonely they are. And if you suspect that somebody in your network is lonely or isolated, you know, invite them to a social event or for a coffee, or, you know, if you're having a barbecue in the summer, invite them over. But I think it's also important to help other people change how they think about themselves. So in my research, we found that people who were recovering from loneliness made downward social comparisons. They compared themselves to people they perceived to be worse off. And that seemed to be an adaptive mechanism that helped them recover from loneliness. Where in contrast, those who were on a degenerating, worsening loneliness trajectory didn't use any social comparisons at all. So I think we need to think about, you know, actually, we are better off than we think we might be. And sometimes we may have to help other people change their mindset and help them focus on the positives rather than the negatives. Because I think as humans, very often we focus too much. It's easy to focus on the negative. So yeah, I think, and if we're thinking about the interventions, we know that a one-size-fits-all approach, there isn't one. You know, people's trajectories are so different that the pathways through loneliness are also going to be very different. So we need tailored, personalised approaches. And what we also need is an effective evidence base, because some work done recently, it was a review of reviews, which looked at existing interventions for loneliness and social isolation, found that actually a lot of them didn't seem to be that effective. Part of that was because of the way loneliness and isolation were being measured. But, you know, there are things that we can do. I did identify several mechanisms for reducing loneliness, which goes back to the tailoring, developing approaches that avoid stigma, because when we think about loneliness, it does have negative connotations, and we need to change that. You know, it doesn't mean that you have nobody who cares for you because you're lonely. You know, it's just a result of those life circumstances. We also need to find approaches that support or maintain and develop those meaningful relationships. And as I said, some people need other forms of support. But I think most importantly, we need to develop interventions with lonely and isolated people. Too often, I think we design interventions that we think non-lonely people think lonely people want. And I think we need to flip that on its head. But another thing I think we need to think about in terms of older adults is ageism, because the way we talk about older adults who are lonely actually can reinforce that stigma and reinforce the loneliness. So it is a case that we have to really have a multi-stranded approach, I suppose, to looking at what we should do to address loneliness on a day-to-day basis. One of the suggestions, one of the things that we often hear suggested that as a solution for loneliness is technology, which I always find an interesting one, because in younger populations we say, oh, they're all lonely and isolated because they're spending too long on their mobile phones and they're not actually connecting to people. And then we say with older people, they need to connect on technology to alleviate their loneliness. And while I believe that technology can be a facilitator of social contacts, it's not a replacement. And one of my pet peeves, I suppose, is you've probably seen some newspaper reports of robots to combat loneliness in older age. And there are a number of robotic seals and dogs and humanoid robots such as Pepper on the screen, which are all being designed to be deployed in care homes and have conversations with residents. And although they're designing robots now to be more empathetic and sophisticated and intelligent, are they really a solution to loneliness and isolation? Can you seriously have a meaningful relationship with a robot? And is that something you would want in older age? And if you recall, I said that loneliness stems from that disconnect in quality or quantity of social relationships. Can a robotic pet or a humanoid robot fill that need for the quality in a relationship or the quantity? I think these are the questions we need to ask ourselves. Because one of the issues for me is that when these devices and robotic pets are being used under research conditions, they're often tested in group situations, which then begs the question, is it the robot combating loneliness or is it the group intervention over a number of weeks? And as I said, would you prefer to have a robot rather than a close friend or family member in your circle? I know I certainly wouldn't. But even if they are a solution and they might help us feel less alone, does that come at the expense of how we interact and treat each other? I recently read a book called The Lonely Century, and some of these questions were posed by the author, who cites examples of how children are now interacting with technology such as voice assistants and using very curt commands, and questions whether what those devices are teaching children is that there's no need for politeness and there's no need for reciprocity or care in our relationships, because you ask Alexa to do something and she'll do it and there's no please or thank you. And I think the other issue with technology, when we're suggesting that all older adults should be using it for loneliness, is that we know that the indicators of digital exclusion map onto those for loneliness and isolation. So they have the same risk factors. So the population who are at the greatest risk of being lonely are those who are digitally excluded and less likely to be able to afford technology such as robots, or, they can't afford smartphones, some people, because, it's just a step too far financially. And I think in the last 12 months, we've all been in a giant experiment, and we've all had Zoom meetings, Zoom socials, and they're not the same as face-to-face. We miss those micro mannerisms, we miss the physical proximity of being in a room with our friends, we miss sensory elements such as touch. And although technology has kept us all connected throughout the pandemic, we've seen reports of loneliness and isolation soar. And I think the lesson there is, there's a lesson there to be learned, and we need to think carefully, what is it that's missing? What qualities of our relationships are not supported through a screen? And to answer some of these questions, a few years ago, we'd done some work with the Cognitive Function and Aging Study, which examined whether technology-mediated communication had a functional or an emotional equivalence to face-to-face in the family relationships of older adults. And we actually found that on a functional level, the telephone, text and email did have a functional equivalence because they replaced that face-to-face contact. You could, you maintained contact even if it wasn't face-to-face. However, no form of technology was equivalent to that gold standard of an embodied presence. You cannot replace that embodied experience through a Zoom screen. And while telephone calls, text and email might connect family members and exert an impact on social isolation, we found it had no effect on loneliness. And this was illustrated by my participants who utilised technology to maintain contact with their dispersed kin. And sometimes that was because those online platforms replaced those telephone conversations and the frequency of contact remained the same. Sometimes it was because they had no one to connect to, as I mentioned with the gentleman with Skype. I think the way forward in relation to technology is to work with people who are lonely and isolated, for them to help identify the solutions that would work for them. And they have to be solutions that facilitate that face-to-face contact and not replace it. And I think we need to acknowledge the limitations of technology for those who are vulnerable. And I think to end the presentation, I think the key take-home point for me would be to always design and develop with the people with that lived experience. And we do with them, not to them. Because at the end of the day, none of us are immune to loneliness. We all have a role to play in addressing these issues, because at some point in the future, that lonely person may be ourselves. Thanks.
Thanks, Deb. Fascinating and very relevant presentation, given that we're still going through the pandemic at the moment. I have 3 questions for you. And the first question is, what are the pros and cons of your discipline of work?
You talking gerontology or just loneliness?
Both.
The pros, I think the pros of working in gerontology, I love talking to older people. They tell you the most amazing stories, sometimes the most inappropriate stories, but it's always a joy to work with older adults. Excuse me, I was just going to take a drink a minute. I was like pouring it all down myself, very clever. So yeah, I think the pros for me in gerontology is working with older adults. I can't think of many cons working in gerontology. But with regards to the loneliness research, I love doing loneliness research. And as I said in my presentation, people often think, oh, nobody wants to talk about it. You'd be surprised, actually. As I said, I get in taxis and I go places and I'm known as the lonely woman. Hence my Twitter handle's Lonely Deborah, because you may as well embrace it. But yeah, so I really enjoy talking to people about their experiences. And you can always take something from it, whether that's people will tell you things that help them, and then you can pass that on to help other people. And we developed a booklet off the back of my PhD that did just that, based on some of my PhD findings. I think some of the cons, everyone focuses with loneliness research on the individual and the individualised solutions. And as we've seen in my presentation, loneliness is wider than that. We have those sort of macro and meso level factors that influence whether somebody's going to become lonely or not. And I think that's for me, that's the biggest downside of loneliness research. Although as research we try to push that narrative, very often it doesn't get taken up by policymakers because they're big issues. They're more difficult to tackle, whereas the individual probably seems to be much easier. We can give people an intervention. It's much harder to do on a grander scale when there's millions of people who are perhaps living in poverty and at risk of loneliness.
Great, thank you. My second question is, what has been your biggest challenge throughout your research studies to date?
Apart from getting to grips with statistics, my biggest challenge, I was quite lucky, I think, with the CFAS study, because we were able to connect with people who were lonely and isolated, because we recruited through GP surgeries and so forth. But I think identifying people who've been lonely across the Lifecourse, that's much harder that is always a challenge, I think, for anyone who studies loneliness, because people are, as I said on this presentation, people are embarrassed by it, and they don't necessarily want to admit that they've been lonely across their whole life. because they internalise it and they think it's something wrong with them rather than these sort of wider factors that we talked about. So yeah, it's identifying some of those who are on those chronic pathways can sometimes be quite challenging, because you'll hear the stories of those who've recovered, but it's those, the ones where my interest is really lies, I suppose, is in those people who have got chronic loneliness and unpicking, and are sort of hidden, and you kind of want to unpick that a bit to see what you can do, what the issues are that you can support them to overcome that. So I think that's probably one of the bigger challenges. But I think if we reduce the stigma of loneliness, those people will feel more able to come to the fore and say, well, actually, yeah, that is me. That's what I experience.
And moving on from that, which kind of links with just your last point, what improvements would you like to see in your research and discipline?
We have done an awful lot of work on the risk factors that predict loneliness in different age groups. There's lots of work around interventions, but there are issues the way, as I mentioned in the presentation, in the way loneliness is sometimes measured, and whether it's aligned to other outcomes. So we're not looking at whether that intervention is specifically for loneliness. So I think there's a lot more work to do there around loneliness interventions, but I think we need to move the narrative on, because it's a case of shutting the stable door as the horse is bolted. I think we need to look more at prevention and what we can do to prevent people becoming chronically lonely. You might not be able to stop them becoming lonely, but we might be able to stop people falling into that chronic trajectory. And I think we need to talk more and do more work around that preventative strategy. And a lot of loneliness, as I said in the presentation, again, maps onto other things like digital exclusion. I mean, I was blown away to realise when I realised we were having a conversation with the fire service that actually loneliness maps exactly onto the risk of fire deaths. And you think all these things are linked to things like such as poverty. And if we can tackle some of those bigger issues, then we can start to see a decrease in the number of people who are experiencing chronic loneliness and isolation.
I agree completely. And I'd just like to mention that you did a TEDx Swansea the other year, and you know, for anybody who hasn't seen it, I can certainly recommend you going to the YouTube channel and watching it. But is there anything else that you would like to say before we finish? I think we all have a role to play. None of us are immune to loneliness, and I think we all have that role to play, preventing ourselves becoming lonely if we can, but also to supporting other people we suspect are lonely. You know, and this pandemic, we've seen older people pitched against younger people, and you know, there's been a lot of negative narratives, and I think we just all need to be a little bit kinder and a little bit more empathetic, and have a better understanding of why somebody might become lonely or isolated, and not just go, you need to go to a group and make some friends, because that's not helpful. Yeah, and you mentioned that with people who may be a little bit shy and introverted towards the beginning of your presentation, and I think, you know, with policymakers and writing submissions of evidence to government, and not only presenting at conferences, but also getting out into the community and talking with those grassroots networks will also help as well, won't it?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I sit on the Welsh Government Loneliness and Isolation Strategy Board, and I have to be honest, they've been a very open ear, and they've been very open to new ideas and suggestions for addressing loneliness. But yes, it's about talking to all those, you know, those grassroots groups and supporting them as best you can. Yeah, because, and the more, as I said, the more people we talk to, the more we reduce that stigma.
That's great. Thank you very much, Deborah. And this presentation will be uploaded to the Health and Wellbeing SRA YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Thank you.